By every law of physics and aviation, this plane should be at the bottom of the North Sea. So how did it fly home with its wing torn open and its systems dead? December 20th, 1943, a lone B-17 called Lucky Strike limps over the English Channel, an ugly silhouette against a winter sky. It moves like a wounded animal, slow, stubborn, held together by improvisation and sheer will. Radar screens blink. Men on the ground make the sign of the cross. Somewhere below, the sea waits to take it. And yet, against every expectation, this battered bomber keeps going toward home, toward answers. The bomber is a ghost of an aircraft aluminum skin, jagged where number 3 once lived, a ragged hole blown through the wing by German flak. Cables and fuel lines hang like entrails. The remaining engines scream to keep it aloft. Pilots wrestle the controls against a sudden imbalance. Each throttle tweak a prayer while the plane limps on, improbably alive. Red hydraulic fluid streams from countless wounds along the aluminum skin, thin ribbons and thick gouts that catch the winter light and paint the sky with the plane's blood. It runs in rivulets from torn access panels, beads on frayed cable chafings, and sprays in fine mists where a hydraulic line has been sheared, hissing like a wounded animal. Down on the wing, it pools and drips from jagged edges, each drop a tiny, furious confession that the bomber's vital systems are being bled dry. It looks like a death sentence, and yet, impossibly, the damaged B-17 keeps its altitude. By the books, according to every Army Air Force's manual, this bomber should have already plummeted into the sea. Yet, here it is, clinging to the sky. Instruments are screaming, an engine gapes like a missing tooth, hydraulic lines streak red across the wing. Every calculation says it's dead weight. Every official procedure calls for ditching. Instead, the tail holds, the nose stays level, and the plane keeps breathing. It's not just improbable, it's a problem the paperwork can't explain. And far below, across the channel, someone on the ground is about to notice. Back at the home base in England, the control tower grows quiet. As the impossible shape resolves on the horizon, a bomber with a ragged wing and dark hydraulic streaks. Radios flare to life. Signal lights blink frantic orders. Ground crews drop wrenches and run, tool belts swinging, sprinting for the runway. They prepare for flames, for casualties, for the wreck everyone expects and watch, half-breathing, as the battered B-17 keeps holding its altitude. The B-17 crash lands, skidding on a single wheel, dragging torn metal down the runway. Sparks spit like volcanic fire as aluminum screams across asphalt. A staccato of grinding metal, a ragged cough from dead engines, and then a terrible, stunned quiet. At the tower, they watch in disbelief. Down on the field, rescue crews sprint toward the smoking wreck, braced for bodies. Rescue crews sprint across the tarmac, boots throwing gravel, eyes on the smoking hulk expecting the worst. Flames licking the fuselage, the oily stench of hydraulic fluid, the sickening cinder smell of men and metal. Medics clutch stretchers, men who've seen too much brace for charred bodies and shattered limbs. They move like a single organism toward the wreck, ready to pry open a tomb. Then, against every fear and every rule of physics, the hatch creaks. It lifts, air pours out. Light spills into the dark belly of the bomber. Rescue crews rush forward, bracing for the worst boot skid on scorched aluminum, flashlights carve through smoke, and then the hatch groans open. One by one, 8 men clamber out of the mangled fuselage. Faces streaked with oil and blood, uniforms hanging in tatters, hands shaking but somehow steady. They help each other down, a rope of bruised bodies and stubborn will, coughing from smoke and the cold North Sea wind. No triumphant cheers, just stunned silence, clipped orders, and the slow, impossible realization settling over the tarmac. These men should not be standing. Someone is going to have to explain how. The base commander walks the smoking shell like a man tracing a crime scene, fingers hooked behind his belt, eyes on the torn aluminum, and the single wheel wedged under the fuselage. Every rivet, every ragged edge, tells the same impossible story. This plane should be at the bottom of the channel. Men died for less. He opens his mouth and asks the only question that matters: how? It isn't a bureaucratic note to file. It's disbelief, anger, a demand. He looks past the crew, past the stretcher bearers, toward the dark hangars where answers live under a single swinging bulb. The answer isn't on the crash report. It's in a nearby hangar, under the dim light of a single bulb, where grease-streaked benches, dangling extension cords, and the faint smell of hydraulic fluid make a kind of confession. Men move in half-shadows, tools whispering against metal, while a battered bomber lies like a patient on an operating table. Manuals hang on the wall, untouched. Theory waits outside. Inside, someone is cutting, splicing, routing around a problem the blueprints never imagined: a quiet, illegal patchwork of valves and pipes, meant to cheat death long enough for a wounded plane to find its way home. Under that single bulb in the hangar, Staff Sergeant Paul Zuk is bent over aluminum like a surgeon over an operating table, cutting, splicing, jury-rigging valves, and lines where the manuals say no one should touch. He moves fast, hands steady, grease under his nails, a flashlight between his teeth. This is unauthorized work, illegal and dangerous by regulation, but Zuk doesn't argue with pages. He argues with outcomes. To him, the manual is a death sentence written in polite, precise ink. If the book says wait, men die. So he rewrites the cure with scavenged pipe and grit, because someone has to keep these planes and their crews alive. You meet Paul Zuk the way the war meets most unlikely heroes, quietly in the dim light of a hangar, surrounded by torn metal and the smell of solvent and hot steel. His file calls him a motor pool mechanic. Trucks, jeeps, grease under the nails, not the kind of man Boeing would imagine poking around a B17. That official description is accurate and useless. It tells you what he was trained to do, not what he can do. In the middle of a midnight surgery on a bomber he wasn't supposed to touch, you see the truth. A hands-on problem solver who thinks in hoses and levers, not manuals, and who refuses to let a plane die because the paperwork says it must. Zuk's real schooling didn't come from any Army manual. It came from a cramped, oil-stained garage in Depression-era Pittsburgh, where the price of failure was a hungry family and the rule was brutal and simple: make it work, or you don't eat. He learned to trade theory for instinct, memorizing how metal behaved under stress, how a bent shaft could be coaxed back into service, how a missing part could be improvised from scrap and still keep a machine moving. Those nights of jury rigging and risk taught him to value durability over doctrine, and they wired him to see planes not as pristine designs, but as machines that must keep living when everything else fails. Paul Zuk didn't worship blueprints. He read battle scars. To him, a plane wasn't a perfect drawing on paper, but a living thing that had to keep going when everything around it unraveled holes, blood-red hydraulic leaks, engines shredded by flak. He thought like a man who'd learned to cannibalize a Chevy to keep a family fed. Parts weren't sacred. They were instruments of survival. Grease on his hands was a kind of honesty. A jury-rigged valve was a promise. That attitude made engineers nervous and pilots hopeful. It also explains why, in his first week, he couldn't stand to watch a bomber sit idle for want of a single replacement line. His first week on the flight line felt like a lesson in how war was lost in the small things. A B-17 sat on jacks, one wing propped up. Mechanics leaning over a hairline crack in a hydraulic line like surgeons puzzled by a clogged artery. The official answer, the part was on back order. Weeks, maybe months. Men cursed, stamped forms, smoked and waited, while an entire crew was grounded. Zuk stood apart, hands still smelling of grease from trucks, watching the bureaucracy clip a plane's wings. In that waiting room of excuses, he heard something else, the faint, stubborn voice that would not accept, "We can't." When the mission launches, one bomber is missing. A cracked hydraulic line, a part on backorder bureaucracy's cost, is a hole in the formation. That gap isn't just a number on a sortie sheet. It's a breach in the protective web of flak coverage, a stretched gunner's arc, an extra mile of exposure for every man still airborne. Zuk feels it like a toothache. He thinks in grease and angles, not manuals. To him, inefficiency is lethal. He watches pilots swap worried looks, hears the low murmur of calculation. The missing plane stops being a logistical note and becomes a moral problem he can't walk away from. Zuk walks out of the dim bay and straight up to the by-the-book crew chief, oil on his knuckles and a look that says he's seen worse and fixed it. He leans close enough to be heard over the generator and asks, plain and blunt, why not just bypass the damaged section? It's not bravado, it's a mechanic's question. The chief's hand drifts to a thick manual on his clipboard, as if the answer were written there, and the air tightens with something like doctrine. The chief bristles, chest puffed with uniformed certainty. That's not in the manual, Sergeant, he snaps final as a gavel. Manuals to him aren't suggestions, they're scripture. Procedures equal safety. Improvisation equals chaos. He dismisses Zuk with the kind of institutional arrogance that shuts down questions and protects the status quo. For the chief, the book is law. The maintenance bay goes quiet, then Zuk's voice cuts through like a wrench hitting steel. The manual didn't fix trucks with scrap parts during the Depression. I did. It isn't loud, but it carries an accusation and a promise wrapped in grease and history. The chief blanches. Young mechanics glance at the floor. An old sergeant lets out a sound that might be a laugh or a curse. Zuk's hands are stained, his jaw set. He doesn't demand permission. He states a fact from a life of making do. In that spare, stubborn sentence, you can hear his whole method. Rules are guidance. Survival is law. Something in Zuk snaps. He's tired of polite shrugging and paper rules. In the tangle of hoses and fittings, he sees the same cruel truth over and over. One lucky hit, one severed tube, and the bomber's whole hydraulic muscle drains away flaps, brakes, landing gear, everything that turns flight into controlled flight. It's not a dozen failures spread across a system. It's a single point of catastrophic failure. That realization lands like a verdict. Men die because the system was designed to perfection on a clean drafting table, not repaired in a shellfire alley. He can argue about manuals later. Right now, he decides he will fix it. Then it happens. One shell rips a line clean away, and the bomber's muscles go slack, hydraulic fluid spurting like blood from a wound. In that jittering, terrifying half-minute, Zuk sees it the way a street mechanic sees an ailing engine, not as an abstract schematic, but as men in metal, and the diagram on a page means nothing if the men inside die. Manuals can be argued over tomorrow. Men don't have that luxury. He feels the weight of every grounded plane, every canceled mission, and knows he can't wait for permission to fix what's killing them. This is a problem that requires action tonight. Under cover of night, Zuk turns into a scavenger, slipping past guards and pulling piping, valves, and battered fittings from wrecked B-17 seconds. Flashlight beam, cold metal, grease under his nails. He stashes pieces in a burlap sack, sketches quick diagrams on the back of oil-stained paper, and tucks himself into a dim corner of the hangar to start turning salvaged junk into a lifeline. Zuk gets to work like a man possessed, cutting and fitting scrap tubing by the dim hangar light until the metal sings. He strips down the hydraulic runs, finds the single point of failure, and rigs a clean, stubborn little bypass, a few valves. A rerouted line, nothing fancy, only utterly practical. It's crude, and it's brilliant. A hidden lifeline that will let a crew isolate a blown line and drive pressure from a secondary loop. He tests it with a wrench and a prayer, then hides the proof in plain sight, small, standard-looking fittings so the brass won't spot the difference. He didn't stop at the hydraulics. Zuk fitted simple crossover valves into the fuel lines so a crew could, in seconds, isolate a punctured tank and reroute fuel to the remaining engines, stop a bleeding wing from starving the motors to death. Picture an engine starting to cough after a flak shower, fuel pressure sinking, men in the cockpit sweating. With a flick, a secondary line takes over and the RPMs steady. It was low-tech, field smart, the kind of fix that turns a forced ditching into a limp homecoming. And like everything else he added, he hid it in plain sight. He didn't bolt his fixes on like a confession, he dressed them up. A scavenged valve was silvered and potted into a factory flange. A bypass line was tucked behind a skin panel and painted the official gray until it looked like it belonged. To an engineer peering at blueprints, it was sacrilege, an amateur's hack that violated tolerances and doctrine. To a pilot climbing in for a mission, it was life insurance you could flip with 2 fingers. Zuk knew both truths at once. The work was illegal, and it also worked. That quiet contradiction is what made the modification dangerous and what would make it deadly useful to anyone who ever had to bring a busted bomber home. At first, it's barely a whisper, a curious note on the mission board, one returning bomber here, another with impossible damage there. Officers chalk it up to luck. Mechanics exchange looks. Then the numbers start to line up. Tail numbers repeat. Return rates tick higher out of the same maintenance bay. The pattern looks less like chance and more like a fingerprint. Planes that pass through Zuk's stall have a habit of coming back. In a world ruled by manuals and margins, the data is blasphemy. The figures don't care about doctrine. They keep winking, demanding an answer. Suddenly, the whisper is a problem the base can't ignore. The mission boards started to lie. Where once the columns were predictable, a stubborn blip kept reappearing. Tail numbers that should have been crossed off kept coming back, battered and impossible. Planes fresh from flak bursts with shredded wings, gouged fuselages, and systems that ought to have failed, yet they staggered home. Pilots swore it was luck. Ground crews called it a miracle. Officers called it a statistical anomaly. And down in the hangar, a nickname began to spread like grease on a rag. Zuks planes. Whatever it wasn't chance. Something in his bay was changing the rules, and people were starting to notice. Whispers begin soft, urgent, passed between grease-stained hands in the corners of the hangar. Mechanics lean in under dim lights and trade knowing looks. Pilots nod a little too long when someone mentions a plane that should have been lost. It's not talk of heroics so much as a practical prayer. That one came back from Zuk's bay. The rumor is spare, practical, and contagious, part superstition, part grateful relief. Men who've watched engines rip and blood run now treat those battered B-17 seconds with a different kind of reverence, and the secret keeps spreading, folded into work orders and muffled cigarette breaks, growing impossible to ignore. It wasn't luck, it was a quiet contagion. Mechanics and pilots started to notice that the battered planes leaving Zuks Bay came back more often than the manuals said they should, and those small survivals turned into rumors, nods in the briefing room, a relieved clap on a shoulder, a pilot asking, almost shyly, "You touched this one," until it wasn't shy anymore. Men began to request his crews by tail number. They passed each other cigarettes and schematics in the dark, trading tips like contraband. What began as one man's stubborn tinkering had become a network of trust, a conspiracy of common sense. And Zuk, watching it spread, began to write it down. He starts carrying a small, grease-stained notebook like a priest carries a Bible, quiet, private, essential. In cramped, slanted handwriting, he catalogs every illicit fix, where he stole the pipe, which valve he rerouted, the exact spot on the fuselage he hacked to save it. Dates, tail numbers, the names of crews who trusted him. There's method to the mess part confession, part scientific log, because Zuk knows stories die without proof. Numbers don't argue. Numbers can't be court-martialed. So he writes, obsessively, knowing that one day this little ledger might be the only thing between him and a firing squad of regulations, and that one day it will show 17 planes. He keeps it small and filthy, the sort of grease-stained notebook you'd hide under a toolbox. But in those cramped, illegible lines is the only record that matters: 17 planes in total. For each entry he writes the date, the exact tweak he made, and the tail number, simple facts that turn rumor into proof. Sometimes he adds a note about the mission, the kind of hit the bomber took, even the pilot's name if he knows it. It reads like a mechanic's Bible and a ledger of miracles, and the more you scan it, the less it looks like luck, and the more it looks like a policy secretly being written in pencil. Weeks pass. Planes that should have been scrapped limp back to the field. Crews who once shrugged at losses now clap a filthy hand on Zuk's shoulder and say, quietly, "You saved us." His little bypasses hum through the fleet like gossip, no fanfare, just results, and for a while it feels like a quiet, stubborn victory. But a secret this big in the rigid machine of the military is a slow-burning fuse. Paperwork moves, inspectors rotate through, someone asks for a parts list, someone notices a tubing that isn't in the manual. The air tightens. How long before the bomb goes off? February 8th, 1944. The bomb goes off. For weeks, the quiet confidence in Zuk's secret has been growing into a small conspiracy in grease-stained hands. Then, like a fuse, something snaps. A routine inspection somewhere on base, just another clipboard, another checklist hits the wrong note. Paperwork starts to unravel. Fingers trace a tube where there shouldn't be one. Questions are asked. Whispers harden into formal alarm. In an instant, the little rebellion becomes a problem the brass can't ignore. On the 8th of February 1944, Captain Ronald Fletcher, an inspector with a reputation for being impossibly thorough, came aboard the B-17 christened Devil's Daughter for a routine walk-around. Clipboard in hand, flashlight cutting through fuel-streaked shadow, he methodically checked panels, fittings, and tubing, ticking boxes as if each one were a life-or-death question. He was the kind of man who found what others missed. Captain Ronald Fletcher moves through the belly of the Devil's Daughter like a man reading a very old, very precise book, slow, exact, every page checked twice. Clipboard in one hand, flashlight in the other, he traces lines with a practiced eye. Rivet patterns, part numbers, looms of cable tucked where the blueprints say they should be. The hangar hum fades. Oil and cold metal fill the air. He opens an access panel and leans in. Something about a routing, a joint, a bend doesn't add up. Fletcher's face goes flat. He's not a man prone to surprises. Deep in the fuselage, he spots something wrong. He found it tucked behind a panel where a by-the-book inspector wouldn't expect surprises, an extra run of tubing and a small, cheap-looking valve that belonged in a garage, not a Boeing drawing. Fletcher stared at the part, then at his blueprint, then back again. The lines didn't match. The schematic had no note, no revision, no excuse. For a man whose world lived in margins and signatures, it was a cold, impossible proof that someone had rewritten the airplane in the field. It didn't feel like clever maintenance. It felt like a secret surgery. And secrets, in this business, always demanded answers. Alarmed, Fletcher tightens his mouth and doesn't let it go. He drags the plane's maintenance folder out, flips open grease-stained logs and work orders, cross-checking dates, tail numbers, and odd parts requests with the kind of slow, surgical patience inspectors have. He traces every repair, every signature, scanning for the irregularity that turned curiosity into a lead. Captain Ronald Fletcher doesn't simply find a rogue tube, he follows a trail. He digs through maintenance cards, traces serial stamps and handwritten dates, watches the same odd twist and solder job reappear in 3 different records until all roads lead to one bench, one man. Staff Sergeant Paul Zuk. The name lands with the weight of a verdict. Rumors in the bay suddenly make sense. What looked like a curious anomaly becomes a pattern, deliberate and documented. Fletcher closes the file and feels the room tighten. This is no anonymous fix. The inspector now has a person to confront. Fletcher storms into the hangar like a thunderclap, the offending part clenched in his fist, a piece that has no right to be there. He towers over Zuk, voice cold with accusation, every eye in the bay snapping to them. Tools frozen mid-spark as grease-streaked mechanics fall silent, and Zuk, surrounded by his scavenged trophies, stands steady but cornered, his secret finally exposed. Zuk doesn't deny it. He doesn't plead or try to spin a story. For a beat, the hangar goes silent, only the inspector's hard eyes and the offending valve, held like proof in his hand. Everything else blurs. This is no longer about grease-stained cleverness. It's a violation laid bare, a public crisis that could mean a court-martial, ruined careers, and the removal of the one-person crews secretly trusted. The weight of every returned bomber, every whispered miracle, settles on him. He can feel the machine of command starting to turn, slow and unavoidable, and whatever he does next will decide if he's scapegoat or savior. He doesn't argue, he doesn't flinch. Calm as a man who's fixed worse things with less, Zuk walks to his toolbox, flips it open, and pulls out a grease-stained, dog-eared logbook, pages smudged, margins crowded with shorthand and rough diagrams. It's an ordinary object with extraordinary weight. In that quiet, deliberate gesture, he offers more than excuses, he offers proof. Zuk doesn't plead. He lifts the grease-streaked notebook like a prosecutor, sliding evidence across a table, and holds it out, small, stubborn proof in a world of manuals and memos. The hangar seems to lean in, oil-smudged pages, cramped numbers, fingerprints where he'd counted miracles one by one, everything practical, nothing pretty. This is his only defense, rows of dates, tail numbers, brief notes that say who lived and why. He offers it to Fletcher with the same calm he used to steady a wrench under fire, and when Fletcher's fingers close on the book, the tension in the room tightens, waiting for the truth to be read. Fletcher takes the grease-stained log like it's evidence, thumbs the pages as if hoping for a mistake, and then reads, 17 illicitly modified planes, 17 counts of violating regulations. The numbers sit on the page like a verdict. Dates, tail numbers, tiny drawings of valves and scrawled instructions. He reads them twice, thrice, because the first pass feels impossible. This isn't one desperate hack or a lucky fluke. It's a pattern, methodical and deliberate. The hangar hum goes silent in his head. For a man whose world is black ink and blueprints, the ink is telling a different story, and it's not one he knows how to punish. Zuk flips the grease-stained log toward Fletcher and taps 3 fat, black-inked entries, like a man pointing out body parts. Dates, tail numbers, a few terse notes, right wing severed, primary fluid lost, controls jammed. Each line ends with the same solitary, impossible word, returned. Fletcher stares at the handwriting, at the mission report stapled to the pages, at the pictures of ripped metal and screaming hydraulic lines patched with Zuk's crude fittings. The air in the hangar goes thin. These aren't near misses, they're catastrophic hits that should have spelled doom. And yet, somehow, every one of those 3 crews came home. He doesn't argue. He lays the grease-stained log on the bench, taps 3 circled entries and says, "According to the statistics, all 3 should have been lost. All 3 came home." The room goes quiet. Men who worship blueprints feel their certainty wobble. Fletcher's jaw tightens, Carlson shifts, suddenly between the comfort of theory and the bluntness of raw data. Numbers don't plead, they just point. 17 illicit mods, 3 catastrophic hits that, by every manual, meant the end, yet each crew walked away. In that hangar, a dirty little notebook becomes the most dangerous piece of evidence. The discovery hits like a thunderclap through the base, not a quiet reprimand, but an uproar that rattles officers' desks and mess hall chatter alike. Men who had once slapped Zuk on the back now fall silent when he walks by. Mechanics avoid his bay as if dirt could stick to them by association. He isn't hauled away with cuffs or headlines, but they strip his tools, lock his bench, and put him under informal arrest, confined to the base, supervised, cut off from the work that made him dangerous and indispensable. He sits across from sharper faces and duller faces, his grease-stained logbook laid out like both evidence and an explanation, while the brass wrestle with a brutal question. Punish the rule breaker, or admit that the man they condemned might have been saving lives. The immediate threat is a court-martial, a formal charge that could strip Paul Zuk of rank, send him to prison, and make an example of him for anyone tempted to fix things outside the book. In the gray hours on base, the word spreads like an infection. You broke regs, you endangered government property, you disobeyed direct orders. Men who owe their lives to a greasy hand hold their breath. Officers who answer to paperwork itch for discipline. Zuk sits under informal arrest, sleeves stained with oil, quiet as the storm builds and tucked in his toolbox. The one piece of evidence no one wants to ignore sits his grease-stained logbook. The logbook turns the argument into a fact you can't argue away. Neat, grease-stained pages, listing dates, tail numbers, and the exact fixes that keep crews coming home simple, powerful, undeniable. Officers flip through it like jurors. On one hand, Zuk has broken orders and tinkered with government property. On the other, he has a ledger that reads like a life preserver. What do you do when the math saves men but shreds regulation? For a moment, the base feels paralyzed, discipline and duty locked in a stalemate, until someone decides this is too big for the hangar and they call in the men from the states. The bureaucracy has arrived. Then the call goes out. An investigative team is flown in from the states. Men in crisp uniforms and civilian suits land like a corrective force inspectors, engineers, papermen with clipboards and protocols. Their arrival turns a local squabble into official business. Zuk's grease-stained logbook now faces the full weight of bureaucracy, and what worked in the hangar must prove itself under rules he never asked to play by. They flew in from the States with clipboards and credentials, a little squadron of bureaucracy, sent to make sense of something that shouldn't exist. Leading them was Carlson, the Boeing engineer, the man whose signatures sat on the very blueprints Zuk had quietly rewritten in the dark. Carlson wasn't just an inspector. He was the living, breathing embodiment of the official design part, corporate expert, part guardian of the rulebook. And by showing up, he turned Zuk's scrappy, life-saving tinkering into a direct challenge to the authority he represented. This is the moment the war between manuals and mechanics becomes personal. Carlson's face tightens like a wrench as he stares at the jury-rigged plumbing. To him, this isn't cleverness, it's chaos. He's the man who signs drawings, who measures tolerances in microns, and trusts calculations more than gut instinct. So, seeing scrap pipe fixes and hand-drilled bypasses feels like an insult to a lifetime of precision. In his world, every part has a reason, every valve a tested path. Zuk's shortcuts threaten more than hardware, they threaten doctrine, predictability, and lives by making the aircraft a patchwork of improvisation. He's not just annoyed, he's alarmed, and he's already framing what he'll say next, a lecture on why this help is engineering heresy. In the cavernous hangar, under a single swinging lamp and the smell of oil, Carlson paces the exposed ribs of a half-disassembled B17 and lectures like a man reading from the Bible of aeronautics. He's cold, precise hands chopping the air as he names sins, unauthorized plumbing, unknown stresses, undone calculations. Zuk stands silent, grease on his knuckles, every sentence landing like a courtroom hammer. You can't patch safety with hope. Carlson's fury is technical, not personal. He's not angry at the man so much as at the idea that survivability could be bought with jury-rigged shortcuts. He finishes and prepares to outline the real dangers, pressure tolerances, flow rates, warranty voids, forcing the debate from moral to mechanical. Carlson unloads a fire hose of jargon: pressure tolerances, flow rates, burst margins, and warranty invalidations, each term polished like a courtroom exhibit meant to intimidate and close the case. He talks in diagrams and caveats, wielding the authority of the drawing board as if it were law. Zuk stands silent, grease under his nails, the smell of oil still on his hands. He doesn't interrupt. He doesn't sputter an apology. Instead, he lets the engineer finish, letting the technical certainty hang in the air, because when the lecture ends, he already knows the single, quiet question that will cut through it all. Carlson finishes his lecture terms tossed like gauntlets, formulas that sound like armor, and the hangar hums with the uneasy clatter of tools and held breath. Zuk stands silent for a beat, grease under his nails, eyes flat on the engineer. Then, soft as a whisper but sharp as a bullet, he asks, "When's the last time you flew a combat mission over Germany?" The question lands heavier than any schematic. Men who'd been nodding along stop. Carlson's face goes still. The room tilts toward him, waiting for an answer he doesn't have. For a moment, the authority of the blueprints meets the grit of experience, and neither can speak. Carlson bristles, his shoulders tighten, a flash of color rising in his face, and for the first time there's no ready retort, no technical dismissal. He has no answer, and the hangar falls into a thick, incredulous silence. Carlson bristles, the engineer's confidence wobbling for the first time, and Zuk senses it, so he leans in, calm and almost gentle, and presses the advantage with a line that lands like a thrown gauntlet. "I designed these systems in Seattle, where the worst that can happen is a failed pressure test." The hangar goes quiet. Bolts and oil cans seem to listen. It's not sneer or insult. It's a simple, deadly contrast between theory and bloodied reality. and you can see the thought forming on faces used to manuals. The people who write the rules have never watched metal get ripped open at 25,000 feet. Zuk's answer is a quiet grenade. He taps the bomber's scarred aluminum like a judge delivering a sentence. "I fix them when they come back with holes in them," he says, voice flat and close to the metal. Different. Perspective. It isn't bravado, it's a lifetime of greasy fingers, wartime urgency, and a rule book that never saw shrapnel. Carlson talks tolerances, Zuk talks survival. One works on paper, the other works at 20,000 feet, with flak grinding through your skin. The question lands in the hangar and won't leave. Whose expertise actually matters when everything's burning? Zuk's simple logic and irrefutable data suddenly left the command with a problem no checkbox or regulation could solve. A grease-stained sergeant and a battered logbook had proven, in cold numbers, that something forbidden was keeping men alive. It was elegant and ugly at once, proof that the manuals were incomplete, and proof that someone had broken the rules to stitch life back into a dying airplane. If they punished him, they punished survival. If they endorsed him, they rewarded insubordination and admitted the official design had failed. Officers shuffled papers. Engineers bristled. The room grew quiet, because whichever way they chose would be a moral decision as much as a technical one. Zuk's logic and cold, grease-stained data have done something worse than embarrass the brass. They've trapped them. You can't court-martial a man whose outlaw tinkering seems to be saving lives. That would look petty, vindictive, and worse, cruel. But you also can't sign off on a field jury rig that flouts blueprints and liability. So the command sits between two ugly truths, the rule book and the body count, and for a while they do nothing, bargaining with silence and secrecy. In the end, the only answer that satisfies neither law nor conscience is action by experiment. Find out if his makeshift lifeline holds under fire. The brass had a problem. Zuk's work was saving men, but it broke every rule. They couldn't quietly court-martial a man whose hacks kept crews alive, and they couldn't openly bless insubordination. So they chose a third path, an ugly, practical compromise. They would test him where it mattered most, not on a bench, but in combat, the most dangerous laboratory of all. A handful of planes would fly with his changes. Monitors would watch every gauge. Pilots would be told what to do if things failed. Zuk's freedom, his reputation, and dozens of lives would now be decided by bullets, flak, and raw data. Command gambles. 5 of Zuk's modified B-17 seconds are pulled from the line and singled out for a brutal test. These aircraft will fly the hottest, riskiest missions and carry more than just crews, they'll carry proof. If they fail, Zuk goes down with them. If they survive, his quiet rebellion becomes doctrine. Next, they're instrumented and watched like lab specimens. Technicians swarm the 5 B-17 seconds like pit crews, stripping panels and threading sensors into suspect lines. Pressure transducers, extra gauges, and radio telemetry are tucked into wings and bellies. So every hit and every leak will be captured in real time and piped back to the monitoring post engineers. Carlson among them will watch the numbers, because one set of readings will decide Zuk's fate. Zuk's briefing isn't a neat PowerPoint or a posture of authority, it's a hands-on, grease-on-your-fingertips lesson from a man who's seen metal die in midair. He gathers the crews in a dim hangar, spreads a grease-stained diagram on the wing, and talks plain what will fail, what the gauges will look like, and the exact moment to act. He speaks fast, no jargon, fingers tracing the floor where he's mounted the hidden valves, his voice steady even when the stakes aren't. The pilots lean in, half skeptical, half relieved. For the first time, they have a plan that might save them if everything goes wrong. He kneels by the belly of the plane, grease on his knuckles, and points to two squat valves bolted to the floor, easy to reach, impossible to miss. Left is isolation. Right is crossfeed, he says, hands steady as a preacher's. He demonstrates the quarter turn, slow and sure, then snaps his voice tight. If primary pressure drops, if your hydraulics bleed out from flak, turn left, then right. That reroutes pressure. That buys you control. The pilots lean in, memorizing every motion. Then the orders come down. Zuk's 5 planes are handed the worst jobs, deep, high-risk raids into the industrial heart of Germany. No easy runs, heavy flak, tight fighter boxes, long stretches over hostile skies where every minute raises the odds of never coming home. This is the crucible. The real test begins. Tension sits in the hangar like cold iron, thick, obvious, impossible to ignore. Everyone knows what's at stake. These 5 planes are guinea pigs, and if one of them splutters under flak, the story won't be about design flaws or brave crews. It will be about a single man who broke the rules. Zuk feels that pressure in his bones. He paces, checks a valve he can't officially touch, listens for footsteps and for the distant drone of engines that could decide his fate. Quiet arguments ripple up the chain of command. Discipline and pride are on one side. Survival, messy and stubborn, is on the other. In the hangar, Carlson's skepticism slices through the tense hush. He predicts failure in blunt, technical terms, pressure tolerances, flow rates, catastrophic loss of control, and lectures the officers about the legal and operational risks of tampering with flight-critical systems. His certainty raises the stakes. Every skeptical word tightens the noose around Zuk's neck, turning hope into a gamble. For Zuk, this is it. His entire philosophy, his career, and his freedom hinge on the outcome of these flights. Years of greasy improvisation, midnight scavenges through wrecked fuselages, and a stubborn refusal to treat the manual as gospel have been compressed into 5 test planes, a handful of pilots, and 2 little valves under the floor. If the mods work, men live, and the brass are forced to admit a field mechanic knew something their engineers missed. If they fail, Zuk becomes the perfect scapegoat, a rule breaker blamed for bravado that cost lives. Every takeoff feels like a verdict. For a while, nothing dramatic happens. Plane after plane goes out and comes back, some limping, some patched, none with the one catastrophic hydraulic hit Zuk has been predicting. The monitors show dents and shredded skin, but the primary pressure never plummets the way the logbook claims it should. Pilots swap stories in the mess. Engineers shrug and tweak. Zuk sits in the hangar with his greasy notebook, counting entries and feeling the clock tick. Hope and frustration sit in the same chair. The experiment still has to produce the failure that will prove everything, and every uneventful return feels like borrowed time. The pressure mounts fast and ugly. The experiment is bleeding time, money, and patience out of the command. Reports pile up. Senators want numbers. Inspectors want order. Carlson and the engineers press for an end. This is amateur tinkering, they say, a liability that must be stamped out. A growing faction argues discipline must be restored publicly. End the test, court-martial Zuk, make an example. For Zuk, it's worse than punishment. It's the death of the one thing keeping men alive in a war that doesn't wait for manuals. Allies whisper, pilots plead, and the base grows divided, teetering on the decision that could either save or doom them all. Then, on a deep raid over an industrial target, it happened. The Memphis Belle II, one of Zuk's test planes, punched through a jagged ring of black flak. Shells blossomed around them like thunder. Floors hummed with shrapnel. Instruments jerked. The pilot swore, For a frantic minute, the bomber was buffeted, each burst a promise of catastrophic failure as the sky turned into a sieve of steel. Then it happened, sudden and terrible. A flak shell blooms alongside them, and shrapnel rakes the right wing, tearing skin and sparking a rain of metal. Hydraulic lines gush, wires snap, and a red mist spatters the cockpit windows. The bomber shudders, yawing hard to starboard as instruments flicker and an engine coughs. Men curse and grab for anything solid. Gauges dance toward failure. For a few heartbeats, the aircraft feels like a living thing with a wound it can't comprehend. Then, over the roar and static, the radio begins to crackle. The radio in the listening post crackles like static-laced thunder, and then the pilot's voice cuts through short, raw, urgent. "We're hit. We've lost primary hydraulic pressure." For a beat, everything freezes. Men who'd heard worse do a double take. Technicians leaning over consoles as if proximity could change the words. The tone is panicked but precise, no room for hope in that phrasing, because losing primary pressure is not a bruise, it's a system shutting down. Heads swivel to instruments, hands hover over switches, and somewhere behind the glass, someone swallows hard. That single sentence turns a sky full of flak into a room full of consequences. Back in the monitoring room, the screens answer the radio. The primary pressure gauge plummets to 0. Engineers lean forward Carlson, among them eyes glued to the plunging needle. Machines cough and whine, numbers blink red. For a moment, nobody speaks. The data is brutal and simple. Without pressure, flaps and gear are dead. The room feels empty. This is the death sentence. With primary hydraulic pressure at 0, the systems that move flaps and lower the undercarriage are dead. No flaps, no brakes, no landing gear. What was a controlled descent becomes a gamble with gravity. Inside the bomber, hands freeze over wheels and levers. Voices thin to strained breaths. On the ground, engineers watch the telemetry and trade looks that say, "What none will speak." Brace for a ditching, or worse. Every checklist, every emergency drill feels academic now. The crew toggles switches, searching for any lifeline. The plane should be going down. Instead, a single defiant hope hangs in the air. The radio explodes to life sharp, desperate. The pilot, breath ragged, remembers Zuk's hurried briefing and doesn't hesitate. The Zuk valves. Turn the damn valves. It's raw, instant. A command that carries the weight of every wrench turn Zuk ever made. The co-pilot's hand snaps down toward the floor, fingers fumbling for the odd, out-of-place knobs they'd been shown, metal under his palm and flak shaking the fuselage. Back at base, the listening post goes silent for a beat, then leans in. This is the moment the whole experiment lives or dies, and a single shouted name now decides which. The co-pilot scrambles, hand diving to the floor, where Zuk's 2 crude valves sit like lifelines. He finds them in the dark, cold metal, grease, the ghost of a wrench mark, then twists. A hard click. Hoses hum. Pressure bleeds into a bypass nobody on the test team expected. For a beat, everything is noise, then a slow, yes, rising lift on the instruments. Back in England, the engineers stare at the data readouts in disbelief. The dim room smells of oil and burnt coffee. Instrument banks throw a cold, sickly green across faces that were sure they'd seen the end. Fingers hover, then fumble. A muttered curse. Numbers that should have cratered hold, then wobble, then against every chart on Carlson's desk, refuse to die. He, who came with schematics and scorn, goes suddenly very quiet. For a long, taut beat, the whole tent seems to be breathing in. Then, impossibly, a tiny blip on a secondary gauge stirs and begins to climb, as if something unseen has decided to fight back. Back in the darkened ops room, The engineers are frozen eyes locked on the dead primary readout, breath held, mouths empty of explanation. Then, almost as if a ghost keyed a switch, a tiny, unlabeled trace in the corner of the screen stutters and breathes. It's the one line none of them thought mattered. It wasn't on their checklist. It wasn't in the manual. And yet it jolts to life, a thin pulse growing steadier, the numbers climbing like a heartbeat returning after a flat line. The room exhales. Fingers hover over keyboards. Pressure is building. Then, like a spare lifeline thrown into a sinking ship, the backup system kicks in. A quiet click, a faint shudder through the scarred wing, and a secondary pressure line one the engineers never thought to watch suddenly comes alive on the instruments. Gauges climb, hydraulic hoses hum, and the flailing control surfaces answer the pilot's inputs. The bomber that should have gone out of control stops its slow roll. The vibration eases, hands on the yoke steady. In the monitoring room, disbelief tilts into stunned, urgent hope. For a beat, the room is all static and frozen faces. Then the radio clears, and the pilot's voice cuts through raw, stunned, almost laughing. "It's working, son of a bitch, it's working! We have control." You can hear the disbelief in every syllable. Men at the consoles stop writing. Carlson's jaw loosens. Fletcher stares at the printouts like they betrayed him. Somewhere in the hangar, a handful of grease-stained mechanics exchange quiet, stunned grins. That single sentence collapses months of argument, danger, and stubborn hands-on tinkering into one undeniable fact. The forbidden fix just saved a crew. Hours later, the Memphis Belle II limped back toward the field, a thrown-together miracle dragging itself out of enemy sky. The wing gaped like a torn flag. Inside, the crew moved with a brittle, focused silence, hands on throttles, eyes on needles, every breath measured. Down below the tower and the crash crews watched the blip on the radar like it was someone they loved coming home, radios crackling with clipped updates. No one cheered, no one relaxed. Hope and fear sat in the cockpit together as the bomber lined up for one impossible landing, and every second stretched like a held breath. The pilot lowers the landing gear. For a heartbeat, the air hangs, engines whining. The runway rushing up, and on the ground, everyone holds their breath. There's a hard metallic thunk as the struts extend, a tiny shudder through the fuselage, then the clean, unmistakable click. The wheels lock into place perfectly, and a single stunned exhale ripples across the field. It touches down like a ghost from another life, wheels kissing pavement, flaps humming, brakes whispering instead of screaming, so calm you could mistake it for a routine training sortie. The battered aluminum that should have been shredded rides in as if nothing at all had happened. And for the first few seconds after it rolls to a stop, there's a thick, stunned silence on the tarmac, men frozen in half-formed exhalations, then a slow, collective release as crews climb forward, eyes tracing the ragged hole in the wing and the impossible grace of a plane that, against all odds, came home. Carlson studies the printouts like a man reading a verdict, numbers climbing and falling in neat columns, every sensor screaming the same impossible story, and then he turns and walks out to the wounded bomber itself, to the jagged hole in the wing where metal has been ripped like paper. He runs a hand along the torn skin, looks at the fresh hydraulic stains, the improvised valves glinting where no blueprint ever showed them, and for the first time the neat certainties of his office collide with the messy truth of combat. He has nothing to say. He is speechless. This isn't a clever idea on paper anymore. It's a smoking, bleeding fact. The numbers on the printout climb where they shouldn't, and the hole in the wing is a confession you can see with your own eyes. So Carlson, the perfect engineer, has nothing left to say. For the first time, the room exhales. Data and wreckage line up like two witnesses telling the same story. Zuk was right. It's a quiet kind of vindication, no brass band, no proclamations, just men who fix things nodding at a logbook, and a man who never asked for permission, finally understood. The rules have been broken, and lives have just been saved. Official approval moved at the speed of paperwork. Tests scheduled, committees convened, cables routed back to Washington, more tests, more sign-offs, a calendar swallowed by red tape while the war kept burning in Europe. Men who'd watched Zuk's fixes bring planes home waited on memos while pilots still climbed into bombers with patched wings and hope in their pockets. It was maddeningly precise and maddeningly slow, the right thing, folded into forms and delays, and every day the official fix sat in a stack of files. The only alternative was what the ground crews had always done when survival demanded it. While the official order crawled through headquarters months of memos, meetings, and signatures, the real change happened in grease and shadow. Zuk's scribbles, crude diagrams, and shorthand notes were copied on cigarette papers and napkins, tucked into toolboxes, and slipped into flight jackets between shifts. A mechanic would hand a folded page to a buddy beneath a single hanging bulb. That buddy would show a wing chief during a midnight oil change. No press release, no ribbon cutting, just quiet, practical faith. If it kept men alive, you learned it and you taught it. In weeks, the idea stopped being Paul's alone and became the lingua franca of hangars across the base. By night, in dim hangars and behind locked tool chests, smuggled pages of Zuk's handwriting move hand-to-hand photocopies tucked into jacket pockets, diagrams traced by flashlight on the back of ration sheets. Mechanics who'd never asked for permission start cutting, splicing, and fitting the little valves as if following scripture, fingers stained with oil and nerves. It's quiet and urgent, a chain reaction. One crew shows another, one squadron borrows parts from a wreck, and suddenly whole maintenance shops across the 8th are retrofitting B-17 seconds with the outlawed bypass. Dangerous, illegal, and for the men who fly them, the only difference between life and death. They didn't announce it with medals or press releases, they kept it in little, grease-streaked notebooks tucked under wrenches and wrapped in oilcloth. Mechanics scribbled tail numbers, dates, and the exact valve settings. Pilots added terse notes on what had been hit and how they'd come back. Night after night, those secret logbooks filled up. The pattern was unmistakable. Hydraulic failures, once routine and lethal, began to fall off a cliff. Where crews had braced for systems to bleed out, they found backups kicking in. Quietly, in the margins and between the lines, the evidence mounted that these illicit fixes were actually saving planes and men. The numbers were brutal and beautiful. Planes fitted with Zuk's clandestine fixes that took heavy hits came back at almost twice the rate of standard B-17 seconds. Twice as many crews walking off the tarmac. Twice as many men who would see their children again. That kind of improvement didn't just reduce paper losses in a ledger, it rewired how squadrons thought about survival, turning whispered tips in hangars into a quiet, stubborn practice. Mechanics swapped diagrams in the dark. Pilots tucked Zuk's advice into flight briefings. It was proof that small, practical changes could tilt the odds, and it demanded a reckoning the brass couldn't forever ignore. Years after the last mission, long after hangars emptied and medals were issued, someone finally sat down with the raw numbers. They pulled flight logs, maintenance reports, loss records, even Zuk's grease-stained ledger, and ran the cold math no one on the flight line could afford to ignore. The rumors and whispered thanks became charts and p-values. The anecdote hardened into evidence. What had started as a stubborn mechanic's defiance was now a measurable effect on survival, a pattern that traced back to those illicit valves and bypasses. For the first time, Zuk's tinkering could be spoken of in percentages, not just gratitude. After the war, the dry accounting finally caught up to the quiet work in the hangars. Both the sanction changes and the secret, grease-stained hacks were credited with saving an estimated 347 B-17 seconds. 347 planes, 347 second chances that statistical analysis could no longer shrug off as coincidence. The numbers were surgical, precise logbooks, mission reports, survival rates, all pointing to the same stubborn truth. A handful of simple bypasses and valves had altered the odds of survival in a war of attrition. It wasn't just theory anymore, it was measurable impact, and the scale of it demanded to be reckoned with. 347 bombers. That's the official number of machines that didn't go down because a grease-stained mechanic refused to accept the manual's answer. But the figure means more than metal and statistics. It translates to between 3,000 and 4,000 airmen, fathers, husbands, sons who walked back into a world that could have been robbed of them. Men who kissed wives on porches, who put tiny shoes by bedroom doors, who told grandchildren strange, late-night stories at barbecues decades later. Some came back scarred and quiet, others whole. Zuk's work didn't just keep planes flying, it kept lives from being cut short. And Paul Zuk? He got no medal, no parade, no page in the newspaper proclaiming him a hero, nothing that matched the scale of what his hands had saved. Thousands of airmen owed their lives to bolts and valves he jury-rigged in the dark, yet he walked out of uniform with only an honorable discharge and a grease-stained notebook for company. He never asked for recognition. He fixed what was broken and went on. The irony is sharp. The lives he rescued were celebrated, while the man who made that rescue possible slipped quietly back into the world, largely unknown. He walked away with his honorable discharge and a duffel bag, not a parade. Back in Pittsburgh, he opened a small auto shop and spent the rest of his days under hoods and over oil pans, trading bomber patches for grease-stained rags. No crowds, no headlines. He fixed cars, taught a few apprentices, and told war stories in slow, measured sentences to anyone who'd listen, never boasting, never asking for credit. It was a quiet life, deliberate and ordinary, the kind of after that stranger's mistake for forgetting, while the truth, his stubborn, field-born ingenuity, slid into the paperwork of history, waiting. On paper, Paul Zuk almost disappears. In dusty archives, his name doesn't headline the change logs. Instead, you find sterile entries, field-developed modifications, a bureaucratic euphemism that swallowed a man's courage and 1,000 saved lives. The diagrams are real. The drawings still bear grease-stained notes if you know where to look, but the credit reads like an anonymous footnote. That quiet erasure didn't make the fix any less real, or the nights his work bought for fathers and sons any less precious. His ingenuity lived on in practice, passed hand to hand across hangars, even as his name faded from the record. Boeing eventually folded Zuk's simple, stubborn fixes into the blueprints of later bombers, not overnight, not without debate, but finally redundancy and bypass systems became standard. The change saved lives in ways the manuals never imagined. Crews who once trusted only written procedures suddenly had a mechanical second chance. It's the strange arithmetic of war. One grease-stained mechanic's improvisation turned into tomorrow's safety spec after a costly ledger of losses proved him right. The victory was real and technical, but muted lessons learned in grease and paid for in blood, a quiet, costly correction born on the flight line. Paul Zuk's life ended up being the kind of quiet, stubborn victory that doesn't fit neatly into medals and headlines. A grease-streaked mechanic who refused to accept that a bureaucratic manual had the last word on life and death, who wired redundancy into wings with scavenged parts and a gambler's faith. His changes weren't glamorous, and he never marched under a banner. But the math was brutal and simple: hundreds of planes, thousands of men, saved by improvisation and grit. The big firms eventually folded his ideas into their blueprints, but his name stayed in the shop. History preferred the tidy fiction of formal invention. So ask yourself, how many of our greatest breakthroughs began not with a lab and a grant, but with someone on the ground deciding rules were less important than keeping people alive?